So good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. The idea of today's session is interactive, and it's a discussion. So what we've done is, I jokingly call this SSHRC Confidential. So if you know the Anthony Bourdain book about the confidential, the secret stuff behind SSHRC. So everybody who's part of the panel has adjudicated for SSHRC in one or many ways. And the format that we're going to do today is that I'm going to present a brief overview of the Insight Grant opportunity, just to kind of lay the kind of groundwork. We're not going to talk about other SSHRC opportunities, but I think everybody on here covers off pretty much every competition. And if not, I tend to have some hand in most competitions. In terms of, if you don't know who I am, I'm Howard Ramos. I'm the Associate Dean of Research in Arts and Social Science. I'm also the university SSHRC leader, which means that I also interact with SSHRC in terms of representing the university. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. The idea for me is to present a kind of 5-minute overview. I've asked each of the panelists to talk for 3 minutes about their key insights on SSHRC, which we'll do after the presentation. But maybe we can start with Chris and then go this way in terms of who's on the panel.
Hi everybody, I'm Chris Moore. I'm a faculty member since 1988 in psychology and neuroscience. I'm also Dean of Science right now. I've had SSHRC funding throughout my career since 1988, and currently I sit on Psychology 10B Insight Grant panel.
Hi, my name is SSHRC. I'm at the Fountain School of Performing Arts. I've sat on the SSHRC IG committee for 3 years in a row now, and I'm usually on the multidisciplinary committee.
My name is Christina Litsky, and I'm a professor in the English department. I was sitting this year on the Literatures Committee, which I've sat on at various points of the last 15 years. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Maflad from the Faculty of Medicine. I've been a member of the Education and Social Work Committee for the last several years and reviewed both Insight and Insight Development grants, and have had some funding from SSHRC for the last 2 years as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Hamed Agakani. I'm Assistant Professor of Marketing in Rowe School of Business, this building. I've sat on IG committee over the past 2 years, and yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for making some time. So I'm going to quickly kind of go through an overview of the SSHRC IG competition. You'll note the fine print is based on September 2017. So I wrote to SSHRC last week and I said, do you have any slides for the current competition? They said, we haven't developed them yet. We're going to do a webinar. And I said, well, give me what you got. So they gave me 2017. I can say with some high degree of confidence that this is pretty much the same structure that's going to be 2018. And I'll highlight any place where I think there may be any changes, but SSHRC is signaling that it's pretty much going to be the same structure. So in terms of the Insight grants, and these are slides from SSHRC, basically they can be what I call a cowboy grant, or a grant, or a cowgirl grant, a grant that has just a principal investigator, but they can also be team grants, so it could be a principal investigator plus a co-applicant and collaborators. The shortest duration is 2 years. The longest duration is 5 years. There are 2 streams now in the Insight program. SSHRC was very creative. They called them Stream A and Stream B. Stream A is the smaller amounts of funds. You can theoretically ask for a grant of as little as $7,000. So $3,500 in year 1 and $3,500 in year 2, I guess, something like this, all the way up to $100,000. Stream B is the bigger grant. It's $101,000 to $400,000. And basically, I would say that the distinction really is that the Stream B is for those that are more complex grants, more intensive in data gathering, probably more team-oriented and longer duration. There's no separate funding envelope in this competition for emerging scholars. So emerging scholars who are, I believe, defined as being within 6 years of their completion of their highest degree. If you're an emerging scholar, the Insight Development Grant is the one that's been designed really to try and hit emerging scholars in the SSHRC infrastructure. So in this one, there is no distinction. The application, it's a one-stage application process, which means that when you apply in the fall, that's the only step you have to go through. In some of the other competitions, it's a two-step process where you have a letter of intent versus the full grant. One thing to be aware of is that SSHRC has a number of joint initiatives. So last year, there were initiatives with national defense, sport participation, Genomics Canada, and CFI. One thing to keep your eyes peeled for is there was a pre-announcement yesterday of joint initiative with CMHC. So if you do housing, some of you I've forwarded to who I knew were doing work in housing. If I didn't forward to you, just send me an email and I can forward you what I have. I believe that each of these initiatives will be a joint initiative, and just keep your eyes open for CMHC. I don't know of others, but I think that my take is that going forward, this is something that we'll see more of, is these joint initiatives, especially with the $275 million in the last federal budget that's earmarked for cross-disciplinary and emerging research.
Sir, question.
Yep.
So these are from last year?
These are from last year.
Are they likely to recur?
I believe, but I cannot confirm that almost all, if not all, will happen in the next cycle again. So I believe that Genome Canada was the first year last year, National Defense was the first year last year. So I believe that they'll probably be around again. So I can't confirm, but just be aware of these. There's some additional kind of hoops and hurdles when you do a joint initiative. In some sense, it increases your probability of success. In some other instance, it gives you an invitation to fill out more paperwork. So it's something to be aware of. In terms of application, it's important to think about the eligibility verification. I can see that these are quite small probably for you. We've had a couple issues with this, with SSHRC. So they look at subject matter, the primary activity, co-application affiliation, primary affiliation is Canadian, the status of the professor. One thing to be aware of is if the budget exceeds 30% of ineligible expenses, they'll automatically withdraw. So you have to be aware of what you can and cannot claim on these applications, and whether or not you already have another IG, so you can't double dip. So it's important to kind of look at the rule book before you apply. There's a committee structure of many different committees. Last year, there were 20 committees, even though they have 23 numbers. They just do these things to mess with your head. You can see what each of these are. If you want to see the full list, this is all on the SSHRC website as well. And I will send this PowerPoint to Christine, or you can write to me. It's open for you to look at. In terms of the committee membership, in terms of who's adjudicating, there's representation in terms of university size, region of the country, language, as well as gender composition. And there's an attempt to try and get a broad range of expertise across sectors. In terms of the adjudication components, there's 2 assessments per application where possible. So in other words, 2 external reviewers. There's suggested assessors. The 2 assessments, is also internally. So there's usually 2 people assigned the file within the committee structure. There's also a committee, once the 2 people present to the committee, that can weigh in on files. Usually that happens for those who are in the middle of ranking of scores. Usually the top and the bottom are pre-decided. And committees have 2 to 3 readers. In terms of the evaluation criteria and scoring, this is actually, I think, worth keeping in mind as you're applying. 40% is the challenge. In other words, 40% of the adjudication is based on what you say you're going to do. 20% is on the feasibility, in other words, whether or not the committee feels that you can actually carry out what your plan is. And 40% is on the capability. And this is one where really this means your CV. So if you haven't been publishing much, you haven't been getting a lot of grants, you haven't been supervising a lot of students, one thing you might want to consider is maybe take a year or two not to apply for the grant, but ramp up your CV so that when you come in, it's a stronger CV because it's a fairly big component. And the nice thing about SHRC, if you're coming back to SHRC after being out of SHRC for a while, is it looks at your last 6 years of CV. So if you have a bit of a hole for any reason, you can mask your hole by having your greatest hits and then a very productive last 6 years, which I've seen people take advantage of. In terms of the scoring, you can see how the scoring works there. In terms of SHRC, now they've gotten rid of the 4A status and they now assign ranks in terms of the outcomes based on sextiles. The budget evaluation is having a closer scrutiny than before, as I was just mentioning, where there's now consideration of what is eligible versus an ineligible expense. And my advice on the budget is don't try to game the system, just ask for what you need and have a good reason for it. In terms of the structure of the grant involves having a 1-page summary, a 6-page description, a 6-page description again, no, that's a typo, so only one 6-page description, unlimited references, 1 page for knowledge mobilization, 1 page for expected outcomes, 4 pages for the research team, previous outputs and student training. And something to be aware of is open access requirements. And something that may or may not emerge in the next competition is a data management plan. In terms of submitting, I can't emphasize this enough. Start early. In fact, for FASS, I've asked people already to self-identify whether they're applying for the next competition so that I can work with them. I can tell you that it's very rare that people who apply or put together their grant at the last week are going to get their grant. So start now. Some general advice in terms of applicants, co-applicants, and collaborators, especially for people who are from the non-academic sector, who are unfamiliar with the SHRC interface. You really do need a lot of time to make sure that they can upload what's needed.
Can I ask a question?
Of course. Actually, so in fact, definitely ask questions as we go. It's not...
Collaborators don't need to fill out a CCV, is that correct?
In this one, no. You just need to list them. So,
Okay.
But the co-applicants would.
Now, the competition isn't open yet, so I can't invite them yet.
So what I would suggest you do right now is give them a kind of heads-up warning.
Yeah.
Get ready, this is what you're going to need to do. And I imagine that the website should usually goes up around now, so it should be any day.
Okay, and the website would explain what filling out a profile entails for them.
Not fully, but it's fairly self-evident. It's a form where you name, affiliation, etc. If you have any spare RA dollars, I tend to ask one of my RAs to do it for people if they're unfamiliar, especially if they're not working in Canada or they're from a non-academic sector.
Okay, but they can't fill out a profile now when the competition hasn't opened yet.
I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
I think that they may be able to create a SHRC profile, but that might just cause more trouble.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask you that one?
Sure.
One back.
One back. Oh, Ingrid.
In terms of knowledge mobilization, what are they expecting? Is it policy implications, research publications?
So I'm hoping to kind of get the whole committee to weigh in on that, but I don't want to necessarily break into that just yet. So if it's okay with you, Ingrid, I'll kind of put that as first question when we get to the questions. just because I think that there will be a lot of different views on what knowledge mobilization is. And I think in this exercise, one of the things you will see is everybody has a different take. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're writing, is to be able to appeal to the diversity of takes. In terms of feedback, and I'm almost done my part of blah, 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 you'll get very little feedback. You'll get a notice of assessment. You'll get a letter of award, which either will make you happy or make you feel like crying. You'll get external assessments, which will have some written comments as well as check marks. I don't put a lot of stock in the check marks, but the external comments can be useful. You'll get a committee evaluation form if your application was discussed, which means if it was in the middle. So if it was in the top, you're not going to get that. If it was at the bottom, you're not going to get that. And you'll get competition statistics, which will show how you fell in terms of the competition. Some other competitions, and this is something we might talk about, is there's also Connections and Engage, which cycle throughout the year. There's the Insight Development Grants, specifically targeting junior researchers or people who are doing significant change in their research. There's the Partnership Development Grants, the Partnership Grant LOI, the Partnership Grant Full, and then there are emerging rapid response initiatives, such as the one on flooding that just came out a little while ago, or the one on Indigenous reconciliation that's currently going. And there are different knowledge synthesis as well. So it's kind of, if you're ever bored, there's always something in SSHRC you can apply to. So for more information, you notice my email's not there. So for more information, you can definitely email me. But these are the actual SSHRC folks that you can email who are actually pretty good at responding, especially at this time of year. I'm always impressed that I think the longest I've ever waited for a response from one of these things is about a day, so which is pretty good, I think. So that's all I have to say, and maybe we'll start with Ahmed and then go this way in terms of what I've asked the panelists. Maybe what we can do is kind of go like this. We'll do like a seesaw. We'll start out this way. I've asked the panelists to give their core advice to you in 3 minutes or less. So if we can go that way, and then we'll come back this way answering Ingrid's question in terms of what's meant by knowledge mobilization. And along the way at this point, just interrupt, ask questions, because that's the whole point, is to be interactive.
Okay. So over the past 2 years, I've been in the management sector, or division. So my experience is based on the application I saw there. So as Howard said, so 40% of the way of your application goes to your challenge. So the actual research idea that you have. And 30% goes to the feasibility, and another 30% goes to your CV and your past experience. I would say that the most two important part is your CV and the research idea that you have. At the time of application, we can't do much about our CV. If you have published, you've published. If you didn't, so you can't do much other than just make sure that you include everything in your CCV account. So you probably know that, when you want to apply for SSHRC, you need to just have a CCV account, and that CCV account actually just put your CV there, and then you just incorporate that into your application. Anyway, the challenge is the most important part. So the two reviewers most of the time are going to start reading your application based on the challenge that you have. The first page, which is the summary of your research, and then a 6-page detailed summary. So that's the most important part. So I would say that most of reviewers actually make their mind when they read your application, when they read that part. And then later on they can justify the way that they see that how you want to train, the way that you actually requested for budget. But the main part of my mind actually was made when I read the detailed summary, that 6-page summary. So there are some, well, how much time I have? Just let me know if I am past the 3 minutes, yeah. So it's very important to just make sure that the challenge is real It's a real challenge. It's a real research idea that you haven't done at this in the past. I can talk about that later on to give you some examples. And the other thing is just make sure that you are not just trying to sell a very small idea and say that this is very important. I'm just going to have a groundbreaking research idea in the world with just a small research. At the same time, you don't want to be too ambitious and say that I'm just going to answer all the questions in the world with my research, my SHRC application. Be realistic. So that's one part that I think it's very important to see in our challenge part. The other part is, well, people expect you to have a good literature review when you are writing your challenge. So if you don't have your literature review done by that time, so people say that you are just trying to fish and it's a fishing experience. You want to just see if you get money and then start working on that. But we wanted to see that there's a good literature review and you just cover all the recent publication in that area, including your past experience if it's related to the research proposal that you have. So don't be just modest and say that I don't include my own publication in the lit review. It's important to show to us that you have done some similar work in the past on the topic that you're proposing, so you have the expertise in this area. The other thing is that in the challenge part, so you don't want to just propose the same thing that you have done past. At the same time, you don't want to just say that this is totally new research idea that they have no expertise in that. So it should be related to what you have done in the past. So I have a few other things, but I guess I'm already past my 3 minutes.
Anna, actually you're better than, I was just at a conference and there was a senior professor who said 10 minutes. He said, oh, no, there's no way I'm going to do 10. So thank you. Anna.
Well, I agree with everything you just said, and I'll build on that by saying one of the things that was the most obvious to me in reviewing these proposals, and you get, like a stack of them, so you see lots, is when people don't use the space well, which sounds kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised. And so, if you have 6 pages to make your case, leaving kind of a quarter of a page at the bottom, it makes a visual statement about how much you have to say, how familiar you are with the topic area, that sort of thing. So I would remember that this is a very human process, that there's somebody flipping through all of these pages, taking a quick look at it as your incidental kind of, or your initial gut reaction is an important kind of entry point. Related to that, one of the things that I've seen in the last couple of competitions that I thought was a really good idea was people using that one-page summary strategically and creatively. So it is your entry point. It comes first. It's the first page. And the way it's positioned in the web form says something along the lines of, think of this as plain language, something that could be given to the press to describe your research topic. And again, these committees, while they are focused around a particular theme, they're very disciplinary in terms of who the people are, what their areas of expertise are. So I think it's really important and strategic to use that page wisely. And the ones that really kind of struck me were the ones where people actually used that page to really frame the proposal that's coming up and introduce it in a really plain language type of way. It really set a nice stage. And it also leaves some room in your 6 pages to do other things when you've used that page carefully. Related to knowledge mobilization, I'm glad you asked that question, because that was something that has seemed to be, at least in the committee I work on, which is education and social work, it's been increasingly important in the conversations that we've been having. And people have been really hoping to see creative approaches to knowledge mobilization. So not journal articles, those kinds of things are reflected in your CV, but in the knowledge mobilization plan, people were really looking for interesting and unique takes on that. And what they were also looking for was making sure that commitment to knowledge mobilization was reflected throughout your proposal. So you've accounted for it in your budgeting. You know, if you want to develop an interactive website to share your tools with people or your outcomes with people who might use them, then you need to actually budget for creation and maintenance of that website, making it clear that you're committed to sharing those results. And the other piece where knowledge mobilization is really important was in the CV itself. So there's a section in your common CV, and I know sometimes myself I've been slack in filling that out. But think about all the things that you've done in your own career to make sure that you're sharing the results of your own work, and make that really clear in the CV so that people can see that there's a thread throughout your work. The other piece that I think is kind of helpful insider information is that I've seen the external assessments used variably. Sometimes people sort of look at them and dismiss them. Other times when there's discordance between the two reviewers, they can be a point of discussion, but it seems to be the committee conversation where the bulk of the decision making is had. Am I okay for time? Okay, great. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina.
Okay. Well, I think both of you have said a good deal of what I had intended to say, so I'll try and move to something a bit different. Actually, my top tip was to be very clear and jargon-free in not only in the one-page summary, but also in the detailed description. I think there's nothing worse for a committee member to feel as though you're plowing through files and files and files, and there is someone who's obfuscating, someone who's using deliberately obscure language to kind of pad or cloud the issues. So that, I think, is, for me, the top thing. So also clarify what your original contribution to knowledge is. So how you plan to add to, and particularly to shift the paradigms, the conversation. How will your approach generate new knowledge? And that sounds very obvious, but I think it's a very important thing to focus on. If your project has several different strands, make sure nonetheless that the central focus is there and not too diffuse. Also, be open to new directions and questions emerging from your research. So I think the best projects lay out what the central research questions are and what the means are of exploring those questions. And there's always something that I worry about when the objectives have already been totally determined and the aim is to shore up a predetermined conclusion. So I think there needs to be a kind of openness there in what you're laying out. And there are a couple things. I mean, the lit review, I agree you need to show what you've done in the area. On the other hand, sometimes you get people who cite only their own work. Mm-hmm. So that's equally problematic. So I have more to say about training and about the budget, but I think I'm just going to leave it there.
Great, Estelle.
Thank you. I think my biggest piece of advice would be to put together your application in such a way that you put committee members at ease. And this means that every part of your application has to hang together. So if you put something in the budget, you want to be able to justify it properly. And I think I've seen a lot of, so the kinds of things I would include here is budget. So have you budgeted those student RAs well and properly? Is it actually convincing? If you need ethics clearance, I think what committee members look for is, did you say in the application something like, my PhD candidate will apply in year one to get that ethics clearance? Otherwise, committee members will look at the application and say, this clearly needs ethics clearance, and does the person know that they need to get this? And then sort of worry sets in, right? And I think usually when a really small thing like that comes up, what happens is that all 12 committee members then pull up the PDF, start looking at your application with a magnifying glass, and then they usually find a whole lot of other things that ordinarily probably would have passed. So I think I've seen that the less time people spend discussing your application, the more likely it is to succeed. And the way to get ahead of this is simply by being very clear, by justifying everything, by putting people at ease when they read your application. So if you're proposing to do something with technology, then talk about your experience. Have you done this before? If you are proposing to do some unusual kind of knowledge mobilization, if you've done that before, simply stating that actually just makes committee members feel at ease. The other thing I will say is this is the first year that we've had the Stream A and Stream B in SSHRC. And I think they're aiming for a 50% success rate, and in my committee, I will say that the ones in the under 100,000 were far more likely to succeed than the ones at the sort of larger grants. So if you're on the edge around 100K, I might just suggest going for the smaller one, if that is at all possible.
Although at Dal, we were more successful at the big grants than the small
Right,
grants.
so who knows?
I would say
Yes.
ask for what you need and no more and no
Yes,
less.
but there are people who are right on the edge, right? So that was my experience. The other thing I will say is that CV. So on my committee, we didn't have the common CV, which automatically allocates your publications in certain years. But people actually had to write it out, you type it up in a Word document and then upload it. And the one thing that really irritated people to the point that applications were automatically dismissed is if you put something that's not within the last 6 years on your application, with the exception of that one section where you can put the top 6 accomplishments of your career. So I've seen this actually a surprising number of times, right? And it's, so if you haven't published all that much, as Howard said, one way to do it is to wait a couple years until you have that. But whatever you do, don't try to sort of sneak things in, because that is something that leads to very irate committee members very quickly. I'll leave it at that.
Great, Chris.
Great. Well, obviously being last, a lot of the good stuff has already been said. So I'll just point to a few things. I mean, and I agree with everything that everybody said, but, and I'll just go through challenge, feasibility, and capability. But I think just building on what other people have said is that one of the most annoying things that committee members face is where proposals have a trust me, what we call a trust me approach. That is, basically they say, I'm really good, just trust me to do this work well. That's not going to work, and it really annoys committee members in my experience. You need to be very explicit about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, not just point to the fact that, you know, you've done a lot of this before, and so, you know, trust me to do it. Again, the story has to be very compelling for non-experts. It's quite unlikely that the committee members who are assigned your grant are going to be experts on your grant. Most of them are going to be non-experts. In fact, on the committee that I was on, you know, I regularly read grants I knew nothing about, and sometimes the second reviewer knew nothing about them either. And so then it's really about, have you told a clear and compelling story in your proposal? That's a really important aspect of it. The assessors, as the other panelists have alluded to, are used very unevenly, you know, because you often get assessors where, you know, that they're just ticking excellent all the way down, and then, you know, that's not of much use. You also find that, you know, SSHRC has a very difficult time finding assessors for grants these days because of reviewer burden. And, you know, so you may be getting assessors from people at very small undergraduate, non-research intensive universities, and the committee members are not paying much attention to those. So, you know, make sure that you're going to convince the committee members, right? Because you cannot trust who the assessors are going to be or how their assessments are going to be used. My comments are really more designed for people who are in the social sciences. I mean, I'm in psychology. They may not apply as well to the arts and humanities. But what I would say is that if you have a training plan, be very, very explicit about it. What are the students going to do? If you can name the students, even better. Say, you know, so-and-so is going to be a PhD student for 3 years of this grant, and this is what they're going to do. Be very explicit about the training plan. That comes over very well because it looks like you're very organized in terms of your planning. I mentioned a couple of things on feasibility. ensure that your timeline is very explicit as well. Like, how are you going to use the 3 or 5 years? And put in a little Gantt chart even in your proposal, right? This is what I'm going to do year 1, this is what I'm going to do year 2, this is what I'm going to do year 3, and so on. It doesn't have to take up that much room, but it's really, really valuable for the committee members. And also make sure it fits the request, right? So if you're asking for 5 years, make sure you have a timeline that is 5 years long. And on KMB, knowledge mobilization, what I found, and I agree with the others, is that they want to see something that goes well beyond traditional academic types of communication, like journal articles or books or chapters or even conference presentations. It's really about informing either the general public or a target audience that's going to benefit your research, or policy or something like that. So you need something in that, and you're not going to get by just on academic stuff. And then a couple of words on capability. I mean, I agree to some extent that your CV is your CV, that's what you've got, but if you're not using the CCV, you're using, and I don't know how many are using the old 4-page.
So in this competition, it hasn't moved to CCV. It's the only competition in SSHRC that hasn't.
So in Insight Grants, you have basically 4 pages, and you can use those 4 pages flexibly. What I would say is there is a section for interruptions to career. Don't put in, I was chair of my department undergraduate committee, and that prevented me from doing research for a year. Okay, nobody's going to buy that. All of these people are people who put in a lot of service on their, in their universities, in their professional associations, and so on. They're not going to buy that. Parental leave, of course, put that in. Those kinds of things. But don't try to build up kind of minor administrative jobs as an impediment to getting your research done. The other thing you can do with respect to, so your publications in the last 6 years, you got to list those, and ideally, if you can fill up the whole thing with publications, then do that. Don't put in conference presentations. But the thing on your best 4 or 5 or whatever it is, there are ways to be cute about that. So a lot of people just put in 5 papers, right? But what other people do, and I learned from this by reading grants, is that you can actually say, what is your contribution, and then put in brackets the 5 publications that are relevant to that, and maybe put in your impact factor in relation to that. So you can actually enhance that aspect of your CV, not just list your 5 top papers, okay? And then just a couple of things on budget. Again, do not inflate, okay? That will fail you. And furthermore, don't try to push the ceiling. Everybody can see, like if you put in a 5-year proposal that asks for $399,998, then everybody knows that you're padding it, okay? So don't do that kind of thing. Make your budget realistic, okay? And then the other thing I'd say, and these are minor things, but in my committee, every time it was looked at, don't put in travel in year 1, right, conference travel, because they'll say they won't have any results in year 1, so, well, why are they traveling to conferences, okay? It'll be cut. So don't put in travel in year 1. Don't put in unnecessary equipment like my lab needs 5 new computers, okay, but what do you need to do this project? Okay, the Insight Grant is still a project grant. It's not like NSERC, which is really funding the supervisor and their program. And don't put in unnecessary HQP. Put in the HQP that you need to do the project. Sorry?
Oh, that's training of students.
Yeah, sorry, highly qualified personnel. And on just briefly on the Stream A versus Stream B, I mean, my experience sitting on the committee this year was that my committee looked at people from research-intensive universities who went for Stream A a little bit askance, right? So I think the Stream A had a better success rate with smaller universities, like undergraduate research universities, but in my experience, Dow, Western, the research at U15, research-intensive universities, if somebody applied to Stream A from them, they kind of look, well, they should be going for Stream B. And so they had a lower success rate as a result. So that was my experience.
Great. Yeah, just to kind of expand on the Stream A, B, I'm a very firm believer, ask for what you need. So if you're going to be doing something conceptual, something theoretical, something that doesn't involve students, I mean, then A might be a better option. But I agree with what Chris says, that if you're a research-intensive university and you're trying to do research stuff, don't try to squeeze your budget into A just for the sake of doing so. Ask for what you need. So we have a question from the floor. We also have still, if anybody wants to add to comments on knowledge mobilization. So maybe what we'll do is, if you have anything to add on knowledge mobilization, maybe share them with Ingrid, and then we'll take for another question.
Well, for the knowledge mobilization, I guess the common things that we are going to see in the application is that, publication. The other part is just presenting in a conference. And the third part is going to be just sharing the results with the community, public, or practitioner, or things like that. So based on my experience in the management committee, so if you have these three parts, you're fine. If you have something further, that's a great if you want to ask for budget and that. So let's say in 2 years from now, so 2 years ago, a group of people, so they wanted in their application to just train families on the research that they have. So it was 8-week training for families in one certain cities, and that was actually a fantastic idea based on the research that they had, and they requested money for that. So they had very detailed information in the knowledge mobilization, how we want to train families in that specific city. And then when it comes to the budget, they said that, let's say, I don't remember the exact budget, but we wanted $20,000 for these because we are recruiting 25 families. We are going to have 8 sessions. 2 of the sessions are going to be online. We need these facilities. 2 of the sessions are going to be in this specific location, so we need to rent the location. So this is why we are looking for this specific budget. But other than that, if you have presentation, conference, and research publication, and just sharing the results to the public, I think you are not going to be failed on that knowledge mobilization part.
Any other insights on knowledge mobilization?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I guess I'm just elaborating on what others have said. I think public outreach is a much larger component now of knowledge mobilization. And I was struck by the diversity of approaches to that. So the idea of performances, public lectures, blog posts, websites, crowdsourced resources, as well as much more sophisticated digital humanities components, so searchable databases. And in a sense, for a lot of researchers, you really have to budget in the IT people to do that. Because often it's actually not even enough to say, I'm going to get a student or train a student, if you really want to have a serious kind of digital component. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that the range can be huge. It's only limited by your creativity. We've had people who have done film, everything that's been said here. I think that the key thing is to make sure that you can make a good case for having that information that comes out of your research being used by as many people as possible. And the more creative and different people that get to use it, I think the committee usually values it even more. Christina, you want to add?
I was just going to say one caveat is one thing the committee was very unsympathetic to are people who say, I'm going to develop new courses based on this. Because actually that's what our job is normally. And we're still just then kind of preaching to, our own audience, really. So. Yeah.
Great. And sir, thanks for your patience. So we have a queue now. We'll take your question and then in the back.
Howard, I think I saw the deadline is apt to be about October of this fall. And when do decisions get made and when does one start the grant? Is it the 1st of April in fiscal 2019?
So, yeah, so the SSHRC deadline is mid-October. You would get the results usually at the end of April or May, and the funds usually get put in to DAL around then very quickly. If you need ethics, you need to get an ethics exemption or approval. So you're good to go usually around the end of May, June, depending on kind of that process.
So about a year's time.
So it's about a year lag, yeah.
I have lots of other questions.
Oh, yeah. So Jennifer and then Sue. I feel like this is a talk show. I'm getting to live out my days of wanting to be Oprah.
I'm curious how the panel treated expected outcomes differently from knowledge mobilization. That's the part that I find quite tricky, trying to figure out how to frame those differently.
Anybody want to take it on?
Well, from my point of view, I mean, expected outcomes are the outcomes of the research. So it's what is the research that you propose going to achieve in terms of the
in our case, in the scientific or social scientific literature. So it's much more focused on the actual science or the scholarship. I've seen people include under expected outcomes, the number of HUP that will be trained, number of students that will be trained, that kind of thing as well. So the expected outcomes is more in relation to the proposal itself than the knowledge mobilization. That would be my take on it.
I think it's probably a good idea, and I've seen this done, it worked quite nicely, to actually make an explicit connection between the two, though, and saying, so if this is your expected outcome in terms of findings, how will you think about communicating that? And so then there's that nice connection between sections, so it presents a really cohesive proposal. So I don't think the two have to be completely distinct.
I would just add to it that in my mind, what I always think about is in your summary or in the first part of your 6 pages, you have your goals. Your expected outcomes are riffing on how they will be achieved. And they're not unrelated to knowledge mobilization, but it's really your opportunity to be very explicit on how the goals are achieved. So I think it's important in framing the kind of discussion to not forget to do that. Sue.
Thank you. How much in your experience do committees pay attention to open access?
To open access fee or?
Yeah, in general. It's a requirement.
On mine, not at all. I hate to say. I've heard that other committees in the past have struck fees associated with open access with the argument that you can apply to a different journal. And I've also heard of committees that take it very seriously. So I think it's variable.
I mean, my quick reaction would be you definitely want to say open access green, which has no costs budget related. If you're asking for open access with budget, you have to have a good reason for why you need to pay the $3,000. But you can't not say open access. Otherwise, the SSHRC bureaucrat will flag it.
Well, in my experience, 2 years ago, we decided in the committee, before starting looking at the application, we set some rules. No open access fee, no postdoc. So we just cut any budget that asks for open access fee and the postdoc. But this year, in 2017, so we didn't have that rule in the committee. And we said that, we are gonna look at the open access request case by case. So if someone, let's say, asking for $30,000 for open access fee for 5 publications, so it's too much. But if one application actually has expectation that, we are gonna have 3 publications, we wanted to have this specific publication have been used the open access, and we request $3,000, $4,000, $1,000, depends on the journal. For the open access fee, we were okay with that.
Kirthi. Oh.
I have a few online viewers who've connected remotely, so I'm just going to throw questions as and when they ask. 2 other committee members agree that it's desirable to fill the research contributions section with publications versus presentations, even if they don't relate to the grant topic.
I see a
Yes.
couple. I hear a yes, yes.
You're talking about the CV portion, right?
I'm guessing.
I
Yes.
think it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, you put whatever you've done.
Yeah.
And the more, the better. Yeah.
You have to indicate which are related to previous funding, so that that may help differentiate a little bit, but yeah, you put down everything.
And actually, Chris makes a good point, which is you're trying to, I always think that you're trying, I look at it this way, which is it's just like marking papers. You've got no time to do this, you don't really want to do it, you've got a pile of them that all sound the same. And you're always asking, well, why are you doing this and what makes this different than everything else? And so, if you don't have publications related to the new research you're doing, you can use your old publications, as Chris was saying, to say, I got this much funding, and out of this much funding, these publications happened. And so it's creating that narrative of, don't trust me, I have a track record of doing it. But we have another question.
My question is on eligibility. I'm what's called an adjunct. For 23 years, actually, I was originally called an honorary research associate in Department of Earth Sciences. And then some dean decided we would be called adjuncts. And I have 13 years as a downtowner in the law school lecturing and planning law. Do we have any SSHRC awards to adjuncts in this university? So we are eligible. And my problem is that I tend to do historical work in seismology or in hurricanes or related things, so I would not fit under the NSERC science. I would tend to have to fit under, I'm guessing, history and or geography. And so I think I see you nodding, yes, you could very well be eligible. The other question I have for you is, let's say I've done consulting for 30, 40 years. I write a lot of proposals, a lot of failed proposals. But if I was to generate a proposal draft at the end of a month, can I hand it to you and say, what do you think? Or is that not your role? Is there anybody in the university that plays that role?
So so you can definitely get Christine to look at it, who is sitting in the back, Christine Whitehorse. So she can play that role. You can also ask the Associate Dean Research in your faculty. Some faculties, like Faculty of Arts and Social Science, we have a lending library, we have kind of support mechanisms, but each faculty is different. The other thing that I think I would recommend is asking 2 or 3 peers or people in your unit or across the country if they can also take a look. So the more eyes you get and the more feedback, the better. So those are the kind of conduits. 2 questions in the front and then in the back.
Hi, could you just elaborate a little more about the open access and data management plan? What are you talking about?
Would anybody like to take this?
I don't know very much about it, but there is a new tri-agency requirement for data management that you just have to be explicit about. It's not in the grant guidelines yet, but it's coming. Howard may know more about it with his connection to SHRC.
So, yeah, basically, in terms of open access, it's now a requirement. And as I was saying, the minimum requirement, well, basically to satisfy the requirement, you say, I'm going to do open access green. And then you're solved. And then beyond that, you have to explain why you need extra funds beyond that. As Chris was saying, the data management plan hasn't come out fully just yet. There's an ongoing process on consultation from SHRC right now. So if you go to their website, you can get their working policy statement. Essentially, the Tri-Council is moving towards us having data management plans. And this will come either this competition or this year. And essentially, it's about saying what you're going to do with your data, how you're going to ensure that it's accessible, how you're going to store it, how you're going to... It's basically part of knowledge mobilization. The Tri-Council is saying, we've given away millions of dollars. Where's the data? How can people reuse it for secondary use? So it's being able to articulate, basically having a good methodology or a good plan of what you're doing with housing your data and storing it.
It's worth saying that the library is really onto this, and if you should talk to Donna Vaughan-Tyson because she can give you very good advice on how to move forward with that.
But again, in a SHRC thing, we don't have a ton of space, but the library is very much on top of this and has a repository. In the back. Oh, flurry of questions. So Dennis, Jennifer, and then over here.
Actually, can I just Or
Oh, and Robs wants to come in quickly.
I have the microphone. So.
And he's got the microphone.
How much should people pay their PhD students, and how do they justify it?
That's an excellent question. And I think we're going to get a very different answer from everybody. So let's just kind of go down the row here. Estelle looks like she might have an answer.
Well, I was going to say it depends. Many institutions have set amounts that they pay their PhD and master students. So in this case, what you say in your budget is at Dalhousie, the going rate is X, and then it's also justified at the same time. I have also seen people use different amounts, and they include different justifications for it. So I think what I would say is whichever way you go, make sure it's properly justified.
Anna and then Chris?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I've seen a wide range of fees, and it often is a topic of conversation around the committee, but as long as there's a strong rationale for it, I think whatever makes sense in your case.
Chris?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that, if you fund graduate students from multiple sources, that is, it's not just going to be on the SSHRC budget, you can sometimes put that in as another contribution. So there is a page on the grant for what is it, Excel contributions or something, I can't remember the term, but
in kind.
In kind or something like that. And that actually looks good because in the scoring sheet there is a line that talks about other contributions to the research. So, if you only need, let's say, 10,000 from the grant, and you've got another 10,000 or 15,000 from some other source, that's a really good way to put it in, because it looks like they're leveraging other money in that way, right?
Yeah, and I've also seen some departments use their internal funding pot as justification, so that's sort of a clever way to do it, without impacting your budget too much.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, these are both, and showing leveraging works well. Mm-hmm. And in FASS, we've been working at trying to make agreements with grad coordinators to use the grad funding as a kind of in-kind or a cash. So any kind of messing around you can do like that makes it stronger. The other thing that nobody talked about is the difference between paying a stipend versus a salary, and that's a whole other can of worms. It's easier budget-wise just to talk about stipends, but you can probably get more money by looking at salaries, depending on how you do it in terms of the justification. And it's a little easier to monetize the salary or to account for salary. I tend to like stipends just because I like cleaner budgets.
Yeah, and I would just to build on that, if you're going salary, then you typically have to justify it down to the amount of hours that the graduate student's going to be working on the research. Like they're going to be spending 10 hours per week through the year at $25 an hour, and you're getting into a calculation that probably isn't worth it. I think stipends are a better way to go, and most universities do have a stipend system.
I agree with the stipend, yeah. So, and also just make sure that you put in your application that, if you ask for $24,000 for a PhD student, say that, this is the stipend that we are paying at Dalhousie University. Mm-hmm. Just make it clarify that, this is the standard in our institution. And going by salary, so in my own application, I went by salary, but if I want to reapply again, I go with the stipend, because in the committees, I saw that, people are discussing about the number of hours. Well, he requested 100 hours for his PhD student for literature review. Why not 50 hours? So it's a little bit tricky how you want to justify that, and there is always discussion around that. So I found stipend might be the easiest way.
Yeah.
I would actually disagree. I mean, that wasn't my experience. This year in the committee, there was a sense that people should not be asking for stipends because that's really the university's job to fund grad students. Hourly salary was, in fact, favored in the committee. And the other thing that's obvious to say, and I'm not sure if we've really dealt with this, is that student training takes up most of the funding in most applications. So I guess that's an obvious thing to say. That's my perception.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's an important thing to mention. If your travel costs and equipment costs outweigh your student costs, you're toast. Mm-hmm. I think most committees will not accept that, whereas they look very brutally on generous student support in HQP.
Yeah, although it's really important to fully justify your use of students. And again, our committee was very unsympathetic to students who are being used for glorified kind of clerical work, photographing and transcribing and indexing and obtaining permissions.
But you can use undergraduates for that.
Well, you could, that's true. You could use undergrads, you wouldn't have to use grad students. And that's the other thing, is to differentiate very clearly undergrad students from MA students and PhD students. So, you know, how are they being used differently is kind of critical.
Okay, so we have quite a queue. What I might suggest is take a line of questions and then answer them, if that's okay. So we have Dennis, Jennifer, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, Fred, and then Sue.
Okay, I wanted to ask about the challenge part of the application. If this is a new research project, as opposed to something that you have been doing for many, many years, how do you tell a compelling story? And how do you engage with the literature in a sophisticated way? Because presumably both can be done only after a very significant portion of your research has been completed, but not before. And at the research application project, you only have a hypothesis supported by, yes, some research, but the bulk of it still is to be done. So what would the committee members' advice be in such a case?
Well, I would right away say you should be applying for an IDG grant and not an IG grant, because that's the difference, as far as I understand it.
That's a really tough one, especially if you already have several projects completed and this is something new that you're doing. I think the first answer is IDG rather than IG, but the catch with that, if you're more senior, is I've seen a lot of people apply and not get it. So the other way around that would be to do something like a SSHRC Explore grant. I think what committees are looking for is at least one publication or one, you know, a couple conference papers on that new topic, some tangible evidence that you are already engaged with this new field. But without anything like that, I think you're on very shaky ground. Yeah.
Although, I think it's about showing equivalencies, because I can say from my own experience, I won a very large grant in an area that I didn't work in previously.
Yeah.
So it's about being able to create that, always just create a narrative. Why the person reading's a skeptic. So Jennifer, Fred, and then Sue.
Could you define open access green and how that would work, maybe from the humanities people on the panel, where you're thinking about that you could publish open access green? So, Howard, you can define open access green.
Okay, I'll define open access green. So almost all the major presses now offer different forms of open access. So green is the lowest form, which means that there's usually a 1-year publication delay. And then you're allowed to host on a website. It can be a personal website or a repository such as the one that Dal has, the pre-published version of the article. So the article before it went into mock-up and page proofing, etc. And then that's satisfying open access green. And that it then shows how to get the full version. I think there's somebody who wants to have a quick reaction to that, or is that another question?
This is a reaction to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Should I use the mic? I'm Roger Gullis. I'm from the library too. And so open access green really varies from one publisher to the next in terms of what they'll allow. So you have to check with the publisher. And there's a resource called Sherpa Romeo where you can search publishers' policies to see what they allow in terms of if they allow it on a personal website, if it's a disciplinary repository, if it's a institutional repository. So there's some variability in that. You can contact the library about that.
Anything else on open access?
Well, I think if you are publishing in the humanities, the easiest thing to do is, of course, to publish a monograph, which is not subject to the whole open access question. The other thing I would say is that committee members tend to know which the best journals are in your field, right? So I have seen people who say, I'm going to publish these 4 essays in an open access green format, and then this one big one in the top journal in the field, and then ask for that $2,000 or $3,000 for the open access fee, and that's okay. So at least then you're not asking for it for all 5 of them, right? So if there's one in particular that you make a really good case for, and then the rest are open access green, and then maybe there's also other forms of knowledge output, that tends to work well.
One of the things I've done in my own work around open access is develop a personal open access, it sounds silly, but a personal open access policy statement, and we use it within my own research teams about how we're going to share data, how we're going to, manage authorship and all of those things. We've posted it, and whenever I have to address open access in any of my proposals, I link to, it's online, I link to the statement, so it makes it pretty explicit. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's okay, that's good.
I was just going to add that one other option that we didn't talk about is there are open access journals as well, so you can name some of them. Fred.
Thank you. My question is about several of you have mentioned ideas of a good CV and the ideas of publications, grants, and supervisions all being a part of that. So, and I also understand that with the Insight Grant, as you were saying, there's no separate application for early career scholars versus senior career scholars. So there's going to be varying CVs coming in. So I'm wondering how that's taken into account. In my case, I'm more publication strong than I am grant strong or supervision strong, early career scholar, who's been really trying to publish. So I'm wondering how that is taken into account. And I had another part, but it's totally gone out of my brain, so never mind. I'll just ask that part. Thanks.
Right. So the SSHRC officer is actually in the room for the entire meeting, and what they will usually say at the beginning before the file is discussed is this is an early career scholar. If there have been career interruptions, they'll list those and so on and so forth. So it should be in the top of people's minds as they consider the application. And in my experience, people are very sympathetic towards distinguishing between an early career scholar and somebody who's 20 years into their career. Yeah.
So then in that case, what would be seen as a good CV?
Well, that would depend on your discipline, I think. I mean that, first in some disciplines, journal articles are extremely long and take years to complete, and in others you can do them like 5 a year, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that, you are being assessed by your peers, and they know what your field, what the norms are in the field.
Okay.
Rob might have a follow-up, I think, to this, or
just a reaction.
A reaction, yeah.
So this sounds awfully similar to the answer process. It's pretty clear that they've coordinated some of these parts. Oh, thank you. And I've really, I think listing the most significant contributions is where things really happen, because, does this journal have an impact factor of 5 or 2.5 or 0.527? Well, if you can tell a story in your most significant contributions where it's like, here's a theme, and as part of this theme, I have the following papers and the following conference presentations and these other translational activities. If you can tell a story for each of your significant contributions, then I think that puts all of your papers and stuff like that in context and tells the panel a better story. I mean, I don't know how this plays out exactly in SSHRC, but that's been my experience with NSERC.
So I should assess my metrics then?
Well, I think it's not just a matter of assessing metrics. I think it's about creating the narrative of how the articles have impact, because the other thing is depending on where people are, depending which discipline, like people from small schools see things differently than large schools, American trained people see things different than Canadian. So it's creating, I think the take home from Rob is creating the narratives to demonstrate how your publications and your CV matters. Chris wanted to add to this.
Well, I was just going to add that committee members will recognize, when you did your PhD, how many years out you are, and therefore, basically whether you're early career or mid-career or senior, it's very difficult to have an impressive, most impactful 5 projects when you're an early career scholar, and most people who are writing that section may even have just 3 papers or something like that. It's much easier to do that when you're a senior scholar. You've been around for 30 years, right? Then you can list a whole bunch of stuff with impact factors and so on. But I think when you're an early career scholar, the committee members are going to recognize that, and what they're going to be looking at is, compared to their kind of mental model of what an early career scholar should be doing, how do you match up?
Can I just add, in terms of, just because I think some of the conversation here has been kind of social science heavy, and I think it is different in humanities, so we can't provide a kind of quantitative impact factor. But I've seen CVs that actually excerpt from reviews of books, or assessors. If the book hasn't been out for very long, then the assessors for the press. So I think there are ways of showing impact
in different disciplines.
So
Yeah, and past training is also part of impact, right? I think the very last thing you do with your CV is talk about all the grad students that you supervised, or people put down graduate coordinator. I've seen things like that as well. On your CV portion, the very last...
I didn't hear the last thing that you said.
Graduate coordinator, if you've done sort of thing, or I've supervised ex-MA and ex-PhD students. If you've led some other kind of research team between faculties. I mean, there's some room in that CV portion to really show what you've done.
And don't forget the undergraduates.
Yeah.
I've been waiting very patiently here.
Sorry.
Well, you're in the management faculty, so for the quality of the journal, so we have, let's say, the Financial Times 50 list, so the top 50 journals in the field of management. So that's one way we are looking and see if you have any of those publications in your CV. If not, then we may just go to another ranking. So let's say ABDC, so the Australian Business School Deans. So that's another list. It's more wider than with 5,000 actually journals, something like that, actually ranked through different levels. So that's another way you can show the quality of the publications, including the impact factor, how many times it's cited, and things like that. There is one other point that I want to just talk about that. When we are talking about the CV, although the main applicant, the principal investigator, the PI, is the most important one, what we are looking for the whole team. Mm-hmm. So for a junior applicant, let's say, if the junior applicant says that, I wanted to supervise 2 PhD students, and that person never supervised any graduate student. So that's the point that that person may bring a senior scholar as a co-applicant in the team and say that, well, I never had the opportunity to supervise a PhD student, but with the mentorship of my co-applicant in this area, including the expertise that he had or she had in supervising a student, I'm going to be able to actually finish this part. So it's important to make sure that, if you are in one area is not that great, so you may just bring co-applicant. If there is part of your research that you want to collect data through the method that you haven't done before. So I'm an experiment person, but I wanted to just collect data through the survey. I never done that before. So I may bring a co-applicant with me and say that, she is expert in survey data collection. That's where I can just show that, we are a team working together, and I might not be knowledgeable in that specific part, but my co-applicant has the knowledge.
This is actually a great point, and you can also use collaborator in the same fashion. Collaborator is just playing that advisorial role. The co-applicant has to get their hands a little dirty, at least in the narrative of the package. Sue was waiting patiently. Now she's already moved on to another part of her life.
Well, and I hope I didn't miss something here, but my understanding is that stipends are tied to, thank you. Stipends are tied to students doing, say, like an MA or a PhD that is linked to your project somehow. Is that the case? And is that why you would use salaries if the student didn't want to do their MA with your topic? Am I getting this right? I thought that was a requirement of SSHRC.
Yeah, I think that the trick is to have a project that you can design in such a way that if you ask for stipends, that those grad students or postdoc, I have had a postdoc, or I have a postdoc, are an absolutely critical part to your project. So without an MA for 2 years doing exactly these things, and you list them, I cannot complete whatever you want to complete. I've seen this sort of hourly rates used for people who may be doing a thesis on a totally different topic, but then you would like to bring them in for 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, and sometimes often more in the summer as well. So those are the main distinctions that I've seen.
I mean, my take would be hourly works better when you have specific one-off tasks, and stipend is when they're embedded in the overall process for the longue durée. Any other student reactions? Any other, oh, here, or somebody from online.
Yes, somebody from our remote connected viewers. Is there any advice on choosing the multidisciplinary committee versus the disciplinary committee?
That's an important question. Any reactions?
Go disciplinary if you can.
Yeah, that would be what I'd say.
It's multidisciplinary is a wild card.
I've been on the multidisciplinary committee, so I'll speak to that. If you do apply for the multidisciplinary committee, you want to make absolutely sure that the project is, by its nature, multidisciplinary, so that you are properly using two very distinctive disciplines and then bringing them together. It also often means that you have a team project, so it's very difficult. So it's not just somebody working in English borrowing some methodology from a different discipline to do an English project. It's somebody bringing English together with something like technology or environmental studies or things like that. I think that SSHRC is actually encouraging multidisciplinary work, so they tell us every year. So I think it's quite possible to be successful. The envelope is large. It's something that they say every year they've been pushing up as well.
Just quickly, just to get at the opposite view, and maybe Ingrid, are you reacting or you have another question?
Related to multidisciplinary.
Okay, so maybe just Ingrid can ask her question, and then I also wouldn't mind exploring the opposite view as well, because I think that it's an important question that has a lot of different views.
Mm-hmm. I'm a sociologist teaching in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie, and my research often it sits at the intersection of health, sociology, environmental studies, and I typically apply for CIHR and SSHRC.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, since SSHRC it's funding health, I believe,
yes.
But am I at a disadvantage if I include, for example, health partners and partners in other areas, sociological type partners, and I apply for the multidisciplinary committee? Just in general, am I at a disadvantage?
You're not at a disadvantage at all. The big question is going to be, does your project actually require the input from two separate disciplines to answer your central question? And then the follow-on questions would be, have you set up your project in such a way that you meaningfully work from the two disciplines together? So probably you're going to have, is your expertise equally in both areas, or would you bring in a co-applicant from health is usually what would be the case. And then you list a lot of if they are practitioners, you would list them as collaborators. Yeah.
So I'm not at a disadvantage if let's say I include Nova Scotia Health Authority, which is clearly health.
So actually, hang on, time out. So here's a quote from Ted Hewitt, who's the president of SSHRC. If it improves somebody's health literally, probably it's CIHR. So if you're doing kind of the social determinants of health, health policy, these kinds of things, then it falls into SSHRC. But if you're getting into trials or you're getting into things where people's health is improving, then it starts falling into this gray zone. So health in particular is one that you want to kind of navigate that kind of space differently.
My work's in medicine, medical education, and I've been funded consistently, for since 2012. But I was very, very strategic in making sure that I really honed in on the education side of things, and I positioned it as professional education as opposed to medical education. So, but I did telephone and talk it through with the program officer and got some concrete advice about how, what would I need to do to make sure that I was clearly on the social science side of things, and that was a really helpful conversation, so it may be worth a personal check-in as well.
So we have just a few minutes left. Does anybody want to have their last parting SSHRC words?
I would say things are getting better at SSHRC, so go for it.
Yeah.
I'd say make sure that it's the right program. So if you're asking for a lot of money for a number of meetings with people, it's probably a connections, not an insight grant. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, again, the narratives, I think, are very different, depending on whether we're talking about social sciences or humanities, because humanities grants and often are curiosity-driven, kind of, you call them cowboy grants, which is interesting, and therefore very unlikely to require huge research teams. That's not always the case, but yeah, that's what I saw.
I think my advice would be to really pay attention to your budget, because if you're in that middle of the line piece, a bad budget can tank you pretty quickly. So echoing what Howard said, ask for what you need and justify it well.
I would say to have your application early and make sure that when you are reading yourself, your application, read as a reviewer and try to just say that, here is the problem. Let's work on it again, to just make sure that you answer all possible issues with your application, and also then give it to people who are in your field and not in your field to read your application and give you some comments. Because again, so when it comes to the committee, one person, the reviewer A, might be in your field or close to your field, but usually reviewer B is someone who doesn't have any knowledge about your field. So make sure that both knowledgeable people in your field and those who have no knowledge in your field understand your application.
And I will just say ditto, 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 ditto. I think this is all great stuff. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, for those of you who are online for making time. I think that's probably the first step, is to start now to getting this done. And like Chris said, I would say go for it. It's a great time to be applying for SSHRC. If you have any follow-up questions, because I saw a hand go up, there might be some panels still lingering around, so just come on up and touch base with them. So again, thank you, everybody.